dois, testando, som. Alô, teste, som. Um, dois, som. Testando som, alô, som, um, dois, som, teste, som, som.
Hi, Professor. How are you? Good morning. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Looking forward to hearing you today.
Me too. I never know what's going to happen. Thank you. So this is the one up. Oh, this backwards, forwards. Okay. Yes.
The student who sit with us represents the student union,
Okay.
okay?
Great.
And also the vice dean. So we're
Fine.
gonna stay here.
Okay.
Those over there are
Faculty.
and these are all
Your students who are packed in.
especially the ones the first year,
Uh-huh. Right.
okay? Ana, tá boa?
Excuse me, Professor J. Benstein. I'm Miguel Godoy. I'm a professor of constitutional law. That has been my advisor for my entire life. So it's my pleasure to know you.
You're almost a new school student, then, right?
Something like that. Nice to meet you, Professor. Very welcome here.
Cadê ela? Ah, é? Acho que ela entendeu que não era pra ficar lá, é pra ficar. Eles saem, Vera. Eu vou lá buscá-la. Tá bom. Então tá ali, né? Ana! 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 Sorry for the mess, but
I think it's great. Just how I like to lecture.
okay.
Piled in, ready to argue.
Emily, você fica aqui com a gente?
okay.
Okay.
I think it's great. And I wanted to do something where, everyone can be involved.
Okay.
That's why I had the translation done. I can feel the energy. It's exciting.
That's our best.
It's important.
Yes.
So, I'll introduce you as a distinguished professor of the New School, the philosophy department. I see that you won the Berlin Prize, so may I say a little bit? Okay. All right. Okay. Bom dia a todas e todos. É uma enorme satisfação, um enorme prazer de iniciar formalmente, aliás, formalmente não, porque já iniciou a semana passada com a Semana da Calorada, o ano letivo aqui da Faculdade de Direito, mas dar início às atividades com o que nós chamamos de Aula Magna, que é um momento bastante significativo, onde a gente sempre convida alguém de expressão nacional ou internacional para fazer uma conferência para os novos alunos que estão iniciando seus estudos aqui na Faculdade de Direito, e também os nossos alunos veteranos. Eu queria, inicialmente, saudar todos os professores aqui da Faculdade de Direito, professoras que prestigiam esse evento, e dizer da satisfação de tê-los e tê-las aqui, junto com esse corpo discente incrível, que não é só da graduação, mas também do programa de pós-graduação. Queria saudar também aqueles que são egressos dessa casa e que voltam aqui para nos prestigiar. Vejo tantos rostos aqui. Queria justificar que o professor Ricardo Marcelo Fonseca vai chegar com um pequeno atraso, porque ele havia assumido um compromisso com o reitor da PUC. Então, isso que impossibilitou de está-lo aqui nessa mesa de abertura. Queria agradecer à professora Maria Cândida, que, em conjunto, que junto comigo pensou nessa aula magna, e também ao Centro Acadêmico Hugo Simas, pela parceria, e que a gente valoriza, desde sempre, e que já aconteceu desde a semana passada. Então, agradeço ao CAS em nome da Emily. E eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação do professor Jay Bernstein. O professor Jay Bernstein é o que eles chamam de Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, de filosofia, da New School for Social Research, em Nova York. Ele tem o seu bacharelado no Trinity College e o seu doutorado na Universidade de Edimburgo. Ele é especialista em filosofia continental, com muitos escritos com uma tese sobre Kant, mas com muitos escritos sobre Adorno, Hegel. E ele, em 2013, foi honrado com o Berlin Prize Fellow pela Academia Americana de Berlim. Ele coedita uma revista chamada Horizontes Críticos, E, nos últimos tempos, ele tem se dedicado ao estudo do direito internacional e dos direitos humanos. Nós conversávamos ontem e ele disse que vê que a saída ética é pelo direito. Então, esse é o grande desafio a que ele se propõe a falar hoje para nós aqui. Eu acrescentaria um dado a mais aqui na história do professor J. Bernstein, que ensinou por 30 anos na Universidade de Essex, na Inglaterra, foi diretor e quando estava na iminência de se tornar reitor, decidiu abrir mão da carreira administrativa por esse convite para se tornar Distinguished Professor na New School. A New School, e tê-lo aqui dessa escola, para mim, é algo bastante caro e sensível, porque foi lá que eu obtive o meu título de doutora. É, para os padrões americanos, uma instituição nova, ela é de 1919, mas ela surge de um desdobramento da Universidade de Colômbia por conta de alguns professores que queriam fundar, literalmente, uma nova escola, sobretudo para propiciar educação para adultos que não podiam frequentar as escolas durante o dia. Então, a New School ela surge a partir de um grupo de professores de intelectuais como uma escola moderna, progressista e gratuita naquele tempo, onde estudantes adultos poderiam ser educados no período noturno, que era bastante não usual para os padrões estadunidenses. Então, um dos fundadores da New School é um educador famoso chamado John Dewey. E é importante que se diga que ela se torna, na sequência, ela assume o que se chamou de universidade no exílio, porque ela acolhe os intelectuais que estavam vindo da Europa por conta do nazismo. Então, a New School acolheu a Hannah Arendt, a New School acolheu o Hans Jonas, a New School acolheu o Leo Strauss, a New School acolheu o Erich Fromm e tantos outros. Não é? Então, essa é a história da New School e que tem, hoje, não é, figuras da envergadura do professor J. Bernstein. Então, eu já falei demais. Há várias publicações do Jay, e eu me sinto confortável pela informalidade, porque é assim que eles se tratam na academia americana. Mas a última, de 2015, se chama Tortura e Dignidade, não é? Um ensaio sobre a injúria moral. Então, há vários outros livros e uma sequência de artigos e capítulos de livros por ele publicados, que eu não vou aqui elencar para que eu não me delongue, porque hoje a palavra, efetivamente, né, é dele e deve estar com ele. Os slides estão com a tradução um pouco abreviada do que ele vai falar, e eu queria agradecer a um aluno egresso dessa casa, nunca é ex-aluno, mas é egresso dessa casa, que é o Alan Ilani, que está hoje fazendo doutorado no Departamento de Filosofia da New School, e foi quem fez a tradução desses slides, e que é um estudante muito próximo também do J. Bernstein. Então, Jay, thank you very much for coming. It's an honor for us to have you here. And so that's it.
Thank you. So, as you just heard, this is going to be like a foreign movie. I'm going to be in English, but the subtitles are in Portuguese. I have a loud voice. Can you hear me all right? It's on. Anything to hold it up?
Yeah, have
I'll start while they fiddle about.
I can hold for you, and
You don't want to hold the whole time.
No, no. He will get the support.
Okay. So first, obviously, I want to thank the dean of the law school for inviting me to give this opening lecture of the academic year. I am honored to be here.
Tá trocando? Pode ser. Oh, okay. She can do it.
She can do it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, give it to me and I'll click and then you'll
Okay.
know when to click. Okay. The global environmental tragedy is most centrally an ethical failure, and one that implicates our institutions, our moral and political theories, and ultimately ourselves as moral agents. In claiming that anthropogenically produced climate change is an ethical failure, I mean that the central question is our inaction in response to the disaster. There we go. We have known about the damaging and fracturing of the Earth system for more than 20 years, and yet done nothing. That should be taken as revealing the blunt inadequacy of existing political institutions, and further, at least, the emptiness, or worse, the complicity of our philosophical and political discourses. There now appear There we go. There now appear to exist massive prima facie moral obligations that have not been addressed. What matters most is what we do to protect those vulnerable to our actions and unable to hold us accountable, especially the spatially disparate global poor, the temporally disparate future generations, and the ethically and metaphysically disparate non-human nature. Perfect. Thank you. Let me begin with non-human nature. In 1972, Olof Palme, then Prime Minister of Sweden, argued that the Vietnam War was ecocide. Since that time, there has been increasing pressure to recognize ecocide as an international crime through which corporations and governments could be held to account for causing severe and enduring damage to the ecosystem. Polly Higgins states that there is a missing responsibility to protect. What is required is an expansion of our collective duty of care to protect the natural living world and all life. International ecocide crime is a law to protect the earth. Her proposal is that ecocide be placed on a par with the 4 crimes. That's not right. I can't see it. I want the 4 crimes. Okay. It's number 6, the 4 crimes. Pass that. Polly Higgins next. Okay, that's it. Her proposal is that ecocide be placed on a par with the 4 crimes against peace: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. Or, slightly differently, the thesis I want to support, ecocide would join the standard list of jus cogens rules, peremptory norms from which no derogation is permitted, hence norms to be a higher law beyond already treaty-based and customary international law. The usual list of these includes rules against torture, slavery, genocide, crimes against humanity, aggressive war, and apartheid. My view is, unless ecocide becomes a crime prosecutable by the International Criminal Court, it is difficult to imagine the tragedy of climate change even beginning to be forcefully politically addressed. State sovereignty under the protection of international legal positivism is the great antagonist of higher international law. Let me turn back to the original diagnosis of the ethical failure of the present. I have argued that liberal political morality lacks a conception of ethical space, who gets included, above all the global poor, ethical time, future generations, and the ethical object, living nature. None of these are part of liberal political morality. Hence, we require a vast revision in our normative language. Where is it to come from? My hypothesis, slide, is that it will come from the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene differs from global climate change in directly requiring a transformation of our understanding of human life in relationship to the natural world. There is every reason to believe that the Anthropocene will necessitate as thoroughgoing a reconstruction of our fundamental self-understanding as did the Copernican revolution, Newtonian science, and the Darwinian evolution. I predict in 10 years it will be taught in high schools. The Anthropocene is going to become our basic language in relationship to nature. The Anthropocene must now be accepted as giving us the framework for our material present. Once acknowledged, the Anthropocene will be seen to require a revolution in ethical life that makes the categorical imperatives of humanitarian international law the foundation for the political morality of the future, if we survive. My argument has three parts. I have to explain to you what the Anthropocene is. Then I have to give you an interpretation of what it means that we should change our lives in accordance with it. And finally, I have to then translate the meaning of the Anthropocene into the language of international law. So the international law bit is the third part. But I'm saying we're in a new situation, and we need to understand the new situation in order to see how law can and must be revised. Okay. I said law for the 21st century. Here's why. The Anthropocene, slide. The Anthropocene Working Group announced on May 21st, 2019, that it accepted the Anthropocene be treated as a formal geological unit, and that its beginning point be located in the mid-20th century, around 1950. As originally proposed by Paul G. Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer. Crutzen, you may know, is a Nobel Prize laureate in chemistry. During the course of industrial modernity, mankind's activities grew into a significant geological and morphological force comparable to the great forces of nature. Rather than nature being an autonomous background to human action, an indifferent externality, the term Anthropocene suggests the Earth has now left its natural geological epoch, the present interglacial state called the Holocene. The thought here is humanity has imprinted itself not only on the surface of the Earth through deforestation, agriculture, and urban development. Humans have caused the Earth's system processes to change beyond the Holocene range of natural variability, causing the Earth system functions themselves to alter their operations. Global warming, as a consequence of CO2 in the atmosphere, is routinely accepted as a signature of this takeover. Slide. In 1850, at the beginning of the industrial era, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million. This grew to 310 parts per million in 1950. Today, it's over 400 parts per million. In 2019, it is now at the highest level it's been for 14 million years. In its announcement of the Anthropocene Working Group, it quickly explained to us the series of phenomena associated with the Anthropocene. Slide. There it is. And this is dense, so I'm just going to read it very quickly, but this is the changes that have been happening, right? So what the Anthropocene Working Group says is it is an order of magnitude increase in erosion and sediment transport associated with urbanization and agriculture, marked and abrupt anthropogenic perturbations of the cycles of elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and various metals, together with new chemical compounds, environmental changes generated by these, including global warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and spreading oceanic dead zones. Next slide. Rapid changes in the biosphere on land and in sea as a result of habitat loss, predation, explosion of domestic animal populations and species invasions, and the proliferation and global dispersion of many new minerals and rocks, including concrete, fly ash, and plastics. Myriad technofossils produced by these and other materials. That's really boring. That dry list is the way geologists talk. And it's appropriate that they talk, because what geologists are interested in is the mark that these changes will leave in the rocks. But much of the phenomena that is here at stake is drawn from Earth system science. And this is especially the case with respect to the decision to date the Anthropocene from mid-century. Beginning at that moment, slide, there occurred what is referred to as the Great Acceleration. It's a chart that looks like a hockey stick. A great acceleration, a term intended to echo Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Polanyi's innovation was to argue that free market economies are premised on an illusion that labor, land, and money can be transformed into commodities without remainder. Although not yet having the evidence of ecological degradation before him, Polanyi was clear that the commodification of land would terminate in nature being reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, and the power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. Hurtling forward from the Great Acceleration, the Anthropocene signifies that we have transformed our relation to the Earth's ecosystem so drastically that we are systematically eroding its capacity to support human life, that we are now living a wrong form of life that has made returning to the stable conditions of Holocene life impossible. I want to stop 1 second and just underline that. When the great Rio Convention came out, The hope is we could prevent this calamity. Everyone ignored those conventions. And we cannot now return to the Holocene. We are now in a new era. We have missed the moment. We now have to ask, what is it to be in this new era? Okay. So this is the way it's going to be for human life for the foreseeable future. The Anthropocene concerns are undergoing a transformation in what it is to be human. Now we are going to have to rethink the very idea of being human in relationship to this new situation. Slide. I want to very briefly say 4 fundamental things that have to change and then interpret what they mean. The emergence of the Anthropocene calls for a categorical redescription of our relationships to the global ecosystem. And I think there are going to be 4 fundamental things that have to change. Slide. First, the very idea of the world as an object of representation that exists wholly separately from the human subject describing and acting on it must be surrendered. Only the Holocene stability enabled the illusion of what's called subject-object dualism. With the Anthropocene, living nature no longer can be thought of as an object whose states exist independently of human action. Everything that happens in nature now is connected to human causes. Earl Ellis, who himself is part of the Anthropocene Working Group, states it this way: human societies are more than a disturbance to an otherwise natural world. Human social systems have emerged as a planetary force within the Earth system, an anthroposphere that is actively shaping and sustaining an anthropogenic biosphere. If you remember nothing else from this lecture, this sentence should do: human social networks are now woven globally into the web of life. Second, new slide. It was a working presupposition of social interactions with the environment that its impacts were local, fragmentary, atomic, and non-cumulative. But whoever now places CO2 into the atmosphere affects the entire global system. Wherever deforestation occurs, say in the Amazon, it destroys a carbon sink and therefore contributes to CO2 in the atmosphere. Ellis's blunt statement of this is: decisions made in one place can change ecology on the other side of the planet. And even globally, human and natural systems are globally telecoupled. Hence, there is a shift from local, fragmentary, atomic, and non-cumulative impacts. Fiddling with your garden doesn't affect anything, to a situation of cumulative global holism. Third, new slide. Cumulative global holism entails that we can no longer operate with the model of linear causality, like billiard balls knocking against one another. Not only do ecosystems in the biosphere and the Earth system operate in accordance with a non-linear causality, some complex of part-whole logic, the causality involves thresholds and tipping points in accordance with which apparently small changes, a half a degree increase in temperature, can generate massive changes over the entire globe. So a tipping point that changes everything. The Earth system science has not settled on a precise language of nonlinear causality. Organic part-whole logic, teleological explanation, and systems theory, feedback loops all are part of the conversation about biospheres, ecosystems, and landscapes. But whatever the conceptual language they choose will be, we are no longer in a Newtonian world. That's not the world that interests us. We live in a world of non-linear causality. Fourth, the most important, of course, the presupposition of all our social actions with the environment throughout the entire development of industrial capitalism has been that our productive interventions in the world are merely empirical and causal. We manipulate certain materials in order to bring about certain desirable states of affairs. The Anthropocene is the recognition that instrumental rationality, just doing something to make something else, that is behind of all of this, does not adequately describe what is happening. So we have a new language, a new normative language. Do we have 4 up there? Yeah. Okay. Of how we have been affecting the living environment, damaging, polluting, depleting, poisoning, causing erosion and destruction, acidification, eutrophication, deforestation, extinction, ecocide. That language describes our interactions with nature. So the Anthropocene is the irresistible revelation that to act towards the living environment as if it were a mere thing, in accordance with rules of instrumental reason, causal reason, is a category mistake that misclassifies living nature, and in so doing adopts wholly inappropriate and destructive forms of behavior. The Anthropocene engenders the requirement that in each case our encounters with the living environment from now on must be governed by norms sensitive to its capacity to being damaged. Because we now know that treating ecosystems, the biosphere and the Earth system, as if they were mere things has been catastrophically damaging and therefore morally wrong. The Anthropocene institutes the transformation from an empirical, value-neutral understanding of our interactions with the natural world to a value-saturated conception of natural objects, of social action, and the new consequence that our actions in relationship to physical nature must be ethically governed. That's new. What do we make of this? What would it mean? So those are the 4 big changes, right? No longer a separate object. All actions are now holistic and global, affect the whole world. No longer is there linear causality, but a new nonlinear causality. And of course, our relationships are now ethical. What do we have to do to acknowledge that? What would it mean to say those changes are meaningful? How do we understand ourselves in relation to them? Assume that the damages that have been occurring cannot be addressed by you individual or by any individual nation state. Only, new slide, cooperative action across all borders will be sufficient for the task. The 4 Anthropocene categories together install the actual, practical interdependency of all humans on one another in relation to the Earth system. The damaged Earth system effectively makes all humans on Earth dependent on one another for the possibility of addressing the damaged condition. So the Anthropocene makes humanity into a collective subject who is now responsible for the Earth system. Call that the Bernstein hypothesis. Okay. We have the Anthropocene makes us a collective subject. Hence the four terms appropriate to the Anthropocene together create collective responsibility for our relationship to the Earth's going forward. We now can no longer make sense of what we are doing unless we recognize that the wealthy nations belonging to the global north have caused unspeakable damage to the atmosphere, but it affects everyone. And therefore, in the future, all of humanity will have to act together in order to respond, in order to mitigate and adapt to this new situation. Taking responsibility. So I am honoring a New School philosopher, a guy named Hans Jonas, who wrote a book called The Imperative of Responsibility a long time ago, and it was happily ignored by everyone. Turns out he was right. Taking responsibility for the Anthropocene as the forever damaged state of the Earth's ecosystem and collective responsibility to it is a necessary horizon simply for non-self-defeating future social action. It is now what determines the meaning of the human form of life, where each refusal of this claim can be indicted as simultaneously blind in its knowing and grossly morally irresponsible. Global collective responsibility is morally necessary because it's practically necessary. Interesting situation. New slide. Outlining an ethics of responsibility I can't do today, but I need to suggest two thoughts. First, practices of, so I want to suggest an ethics of responsibility as the basic form of all ethics. But I'm going to do this in 2 minutes. Okay. Outlining an appropriate ethics of responsibility is a task for another occasion, but I want to say this first. Practices of responsibility beginning with responsibilities to infants and children are the human effort to give meaning and practical significance to the connection between human power, vulnerability, and dependency. Beginning with infancy and insistently forever after, we are dependent for our being and well-being on one another. We are dependent beings. And responsibility can be thought to provide the normative language that connects us as dependent, vulnerable, and powerful beings. Next slide. In anchoring my understanding of responsibility in relationship to our relations to infants and children, I have to stop. Philosophy hates children. And yet, my fundamental belief is we cannot make sense of the human condition unless we put our relationship to children first. And that's part of what I'm trying to do here in offering an ethics of responsibility, because people have always known until now that responsibility to children is the first responsibility. End of interruption. In anchoring responsibilities to our responsibilities to children, it follows that the generative power of practice of responsibility is that it provides a solution to the problem of reproduction. Relations among generations shape and are the shape of relations of responsibility. So the question now is, what do we make of those relations of responsibility to the uncertain future? And my answer is this. Next slide. The Anthropocene undermines any claim of unconditional sovereignty with respect to foundational norms of international law, since what the Anthropocene demonstrates is the actual mutual dependency of all states on one another for the possibility of reproducible states of practices capable of a sustainable relation to the ecosystem, which is the life support system for human living. So the question is, how is collective responsibility possible? Philosophers give terrible answers. There is already a practice of global collective responsibility. It's called international law. So my thesis is that post-positivist international law is the structure of the collective responsibility to come. Next slide. My critical proposal is first, a necessary condition for prohibiting those practices essentially destructive of sustainable ecosystems would be a law against ecocide. A law prohibiting ecocide can be recognized as the determinate negation of those practices that are essential to the production of the Anthropocene damages and destructions. Second, next, in order to have requisite normative force, an ecocide law would have to be one from which no derogation is permitted. Therefore, an ecocide convention would consist of a jus cogens norm of international law. Third, only if ecocide were recognized as a jus cogens norm could the still ideal apparatus of international law achieve actuality, because the Anthropocene itself constitutes humanity into an actually mutually dependent totality that is already and hence must be collectively responsible for the well-being of the earth. Then the norm of ecocide would connect the actuality of mutual dependent lives and mutual dependent states into an ethical community. Fourth, once established through the institution of a jus cogens ecocide convention, this very ethical community could be further actualized by bringing with it the existing body of human rights and jus cogens norms of international law. So my hypothesis is a jus cogens norm of ecocide would actualize for the first time the ethical laws of post-1948 international law, because we're in a new situation where we're actually dependent on one another and not merely ideally dependent on one another. Only the global community can be responsible for the Earth system. Okay, 2 lines of argument then converge here. The first concerning higher international law, and the second an ecocide convention. Let me begin with international law. beginning in 1945 with the Nuremberg trials, but becoming explicit in the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. International law pioneered a revolutionary transformation. Next slide. Okay. The Vienna Convention proclaims a treaty is void if at the time of its conclusion it conflicts with a peremptory norm of general international law. For the purposes of the present convention, a peremptory norm of general international law is a norm accepted and recognized by the international community of states as a whole as a norm from which no derogation is permitted. I want you to notice how the idea of a peremptory norm stands in a one-to-one relation with what I call an ethical holism, that it only makes sense if all states are united into one and individual states are an organ of the whole. Hence, this entails a paradigm shift from international legal positivism to humanitarian international law. Next slide. There it is. You're up top. You got me. A revolutionary transformation in international law. And I want to say, this transformation, I think, is the most important ethical invention since the 18th century, and it has been beaten down almost to invisibility. But my belief is this invention of a fundamental new way of thinking about ethics is the possibility of our future. So the four elements of this are clear. It goes from a horizontal relation of states related by treaty and customary practice to a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is from treaty-based to norm-constituted, from unconditional to conditional sovereignty, from a collection of autonomous states to states as organs of the international ethical community. Now, the bad news is there is an overwhelming consensus that to date, this revolutionary paradigm shift, including the practice of human rights, has failed. And it has failed to operate as a significant factor in ordering social practices, and it is now a thwarted and stalled practice. I have a diagnosis, other than the obvious practical ones, but a theoretical diagnosis for this failure. The reason for this failure is that peremptory norms and ethical holism suffer from a kind of idealism. Namely, the essential ethical totality of states only emerges through states binding themselves to those non-derogable norms. But sovereign states may well believe that those norms are hopelessly ideal and aspirational. For example, torturing in the interests of state security may be thought to be both practically necessary and not harmful to the interests of other states. Slide. Hence, international legal positivism has been arguing and winning the argument that higher international law conflates lex ferenda, law as it should be, with lex lata, law as it is. To date, the interests of state sovereignty remain dominant. What has failed to be demonstrated by post-positivist legal thought is that there is a real and inescapable normative bonds connecting all states, that all states exist in a relation of unconditional answerability to one another, and hence all states must be conceived as having obligations beyond their self-interest. The Anthropocene does this. Next slide. It inserts collective responsibility that overturns the idealism of the international legal community and imposes a condition of global interdependency. States cannot rationally regard the biosphere except under the heading of intrinsic worth. To regard other nation states, they must be taken to be fellow stewards of the Earth system. Hence, collective responsibility for the Earth system imposes, I want to say imposes, the Anthropocene imposes a coming to be of effective global ethical community. Although higher international law came to be for the very sake of overcoming sovereignty, the situation of the Anthropocene shows that this overcoming of sovereignty is now practically necessary. Therefore, a jus cogent ecocide convention would make the potential for an international ethical community imposed by the Anthropocene institutionally and practically actual. Okay. That's almost the easy bit. The hard bit is, what would be an ecocide law look like? Polly Higgins' strategy was to model a peacetime ecocide convention on the basis of existing international laws prohibiting environmental damage during war, the Vietnam War again. Modifying Higgins slightly for the purposes of international law, I want to define ecocide as, next slide, the extensive destruction, damage to, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory, whether by human agency or by other causes, to such an extent that socially reproducible and environmentally sustainable practices by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. With this definition in mind, Higgins argues that ascertainable ecocide occurs when, next slide, there is destruction, damage, or loss to the territory, and liability of the legal persons can be determined. The sorts of actions she has in mind are the usual suspects: extraction, dumping harmful chemicals, nuclear testing, the use of defoliants. In determining these familiar kinds of acts that rise to the level of ecocide, destruction, damage, and loss, Higgins turns to the Rome Statute definition of damage, which is widespread, long-term, severe damage to the natural environment in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. To give this civilian application, Higgins' first proposal is that we substitute the word community for military, and then in order to explicate the terms widespread, long-lasting, and severe, she turns to the United Nations environmental regulations for wartime. Widespread means an area of several hundred square kilometers, long-lasting, several months, a season, severe, involving serious significant disruption or harm to human life or natural and economic resources. In tracking the definitions already accepted in the military context to define peacetime ecocide, Higgins' plausible assumption is that however little used, we have already agreed that some widespread, long-lasting, and severe damage to the environment is criminal. We've already agreed to that. Therefore, the peacetime extension declares that certain economic and industrial practices of polluting, emitting, extracting, dumping, destroying produce the same sort of severe damage to the environment that American bombs and chemical warfare in Vietnam produced there during wartime. Therefore, peacetime ecocidal destruction also deserves to be an international cry. Next slide. If ascertainable ecocide is legally exemplary, we can bring corporations to court. Seems like a good idea. It is also insufficient on its own because the overwhelming predominant form of ecocidal damages will be non-ascertainable, namely massive damages brought on by the general conditions of the Anthropocene. And this is what we've seen: fires and floods and drought. But that we are incapable of saying who caused the drought or who caused the flood or who caused the fire does not mean that these environmental changes lack causal evidence about what caused them. We know the processes causally responsible for bringing about this state of affairs. It is that causal chain that is responsible for bringing the Anthropocene condition into being. As we have known for 30 years at least, emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is destructive to the being of the Holocene environmental ecosystem, and hence to the well-being of the Earth system as one suitable for a sustainable form of human life. The Anthropocene indicts the liberal capitalist form of life as not environmentally sustainable and hence as not socially reproducible. The form of life itself is ecocidal. Therefore, minimally, all those forms of conduct most directly causally responsible for the destruction of the Holocene condition should themselves be legally prohibited by an ecocide convention. That is, we must have a law that says we must stop taking carbon from the earth, and we must stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere. No more extracting of coal, oil, or gas. Under the Anthropocene condition of responsibility, prohibiting these human practices as ecocide is the minimum necessary condition to acknowledge the Anthropocene. Unless you acknowledge that this has happened, you're not acknowledging the Anthropocene, and therefore you're continuing in a criminal way. The moral significance of a jus cogens norm, my last paragraph, next slide, lay in the idea that they are norms from which no derogation is permitted. Being non-derogable means to put out of play an entire instrumental mode of human reasoning, namely cost-benefit analysis, the weighing and balancing of gains and losses. This is the reason why I am tempted to call some human rights and the small class of agreed jus cogens norms, including ecocide, the categorical imperatives of international law, in placing human life and ecological life above the insistent work of relativization by the market. The categorical imperatives of international law can serve as the foundation for a new form of life. Thank you. Two more flowers. Two technical. Two more bigger than these ones.
Eu vou de imediato abrir, se houver alguma questão. Então, quem quiser fazer uso da palavra, então vem até aqui, dirige a questão, a gente colhe no máximo 3, e aí encerro. Queria saudar a presença do the President of the University, o nosso reitor, professor Ricardo Marcelo. Então, a palavra está aberta. Você daí se apresenta e... Você pode vir aqui, por favor?
É para tentar fazer em inglês a pergunta? Hi, my name is Laura. At first, I'd like to say I'm flattered for you to be here today and for us to be able to question such an authority in the subject. And I would like to know your perspective about younger generations, like this necessity of proactivity being fall over younger generations, like Greta Thunberg and other leaderships. And we, like, how can I say, we can't expect something from people already in power, and I would like to know your perspective about it, and how can I say it? Depend on future generations in this context that we don't even know that we are going to have a future.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So your question is the very reason I wrote this lecture. I wrote this lecture because I believe my generation has not only failed, but failed in a criminal matter. So I have a T-shirt that says, "I'm with Greta." I want to be clear that the older generation really has failed you and failed you terribly, and they are not going to live in the world that is going to be difficult beyond our present imagining. So my first thought to you is, I've been talking about international law. Law is as only powerful as the politics supporting it. You can't separate law from a politics. And the politics, why is there no ecocide convention? Because powerful interests do not want an ecocide convention because it would make their life impossible. It harms the sovereignty of states, and it harms big corporations. So the powers do not want an ecocide convention, and they have always resisted it. People have tried. It will only happen if globally your generation takes to the streets. I honestly believe that is clear right now that the adults cannot be trusted. They have failed their trust, and unless you all take political power as your own and begin asking for this future, then the words I have echoed here and put down are just words and not a framework for a practice. I meant them to be exactly an inspiration, that it's not a series of policy. We can begin thinking about a new form of life. And the new form of life has to do in part with global youth, that young people all over the globe know that the current situation is insupportable, and still, which is how I began the lecture, we have done nothing. So, yeah, it's really, this is a call to the youth to think of international law, global international law, humanitarian international law as theirs. My view is it failed, and now is the moment that humanitarian international law can become actual. This is its moment, I think.
Por favor.
So just to encourage you all, when I last gave this lecture, everybody in the room raised their hand with a question. So feel free. I came here only to hear your questions.
Good morning, my name is Gabriel. Although in an ideal world, the concept of the Anthropocene would surpass basic political divisions, such is obviously not the case.
Right.
Who do you personally identify as the presidential candidate in this upcoming presidential election of the US that is more concerned about the Anthropocene and will guarantee more respect to such concept?
So I wish I had a great answer. My real answer is any non-Trump who can get elected is the best we can do. Part of the problem is the notion of a green revolution or a green New Deal is always part of a list, and it's always at the bottom of the list. We need Medicare for all, we need this, we need that. This is an old man's list, and only old men are running. No one under 40 would not have climate change as the first thing on their list. So no one is going to be ideal, but a Democrat is better than Trump, who denies climate change, of course.
Except
Yes, my heart pounds for Elizabeth Warren, but she's no longer there.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor. I am a student of PhD in PUC Law School, and I am actually studying kind of this subject in my doctoral project. And I would like to know your opinion about the importance of the international human courts in fighting the ecocide, and especially what is your opinion about the possibility of recognizing the bottom-up recognizing of the human right to a healthy environment, and about the concept of the human right to the healthy environment also. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So my answer to this is the whole book I'm writing. I'm writing a book on human rights and ecocide. But my view, which may disappoint you, is there is a whole school of thought that thinks of the environment in connection with human rights. And there are, therefore, human rights to a healthy environment is the idea. And there have been attempts to bring this to court, and they've all failed. So my view is that human rights are deeply important. Half of my book is about defending human rights. But I do not think human rights are the best way to think about climate change in the Anthropocene. Because the Anthropocene, you have to, and this is what makes what I'm doing strange. I want to explain the strangeness. I'm saying that if you want to understand our relationships to one another, we have to get right our relationships to the natural world. So I am putting our relationships to the natural world, hence the problem of ecocide, as first, and saying that only if we agree that we cannot treat the earth that way, can we then realize we can treat one another that way. Because right now, there is no penalty. Here's why. There's no penalty for us treating one another badly in the global world. Things happen in Africa, doesn't matter to Donald Trump one bit. Climate change is different. Each destructive act literally makes things worse for everyone. That's what I mean by the notion of actuality. We are actually joined by this new condition, and not merely ideally, not morally we should care about one another. In ecocide we have to, or what we're doing is practically self-defeating. So my thought, and there's a long story here about Theodore Adorno, but I'll save you from that. Until we get our relationships to nature right, we can't get our relationships to one another right. So human rights have to be part of a larger story. So in that sense, I'm actually not supportive of human right to a good in climate. I don't think that's going to be politically productive or ethically productive, but obviously a source for debate.
Então, acho que podemos encerrar, né? Acho, gostaria de agradecer imensamente ao professor Jay Bernstein por sua conferência. Jay, thank you very much for your lecture. Dizer que reiterar a satisfação e a honra de tê-lo aqui na nossa Faculdade de Direito, não é? Agradecer a presença do professor Ricardo Marcelo Fonseca e também reiterar que é uma satisfação e uma honra ter o nosso reitor aqui, prestigiando a nossa aula magna. Agradecer a professora Maria Cândida também, né, que compartilha essa mesa, e a Emily, do Centro Acadêmico Gucimas, todos os professores aqui presentes do nosso corpo docente, né, todos os demais convidados, alunas, alunos de graduação e pós-graduação, especialmente os calouros, a quem eu dirijo uma especial palavra de boas-vindas, mais uma vez, e relembrando que há exatos 37 anos, eu estava nessa condição e também, da mesma forma, eu escutei, houve uma conferência, né, e que de imediato pareceu cheia de conceitos e categorias pouco compreensíveis para quem ingressava na Faculdade de Direito, mas que ficaram na minha memória e na memória de todos os que naquele momento compartilhavam. Todos aqui já passaram por uma aula magna, e é esse fazer sentido que a escola vai proporcionar a todos vocês. Então, a lembrança que eu tenho melhor, e essa eu tenho que declarar, né, é quando o professor Lamartine trazia uns professores alemães aqui, e aquilo sim era difícil de seguir pela língua e pela própria racionalidade, E eu sempre me perguntava, né, quando isso vai fazer sentido para mim. E depois eu vi o quanto fez sentido para mim. E hoje vocês têm um acesso muito maior a esses convidados, não é, que reiteradamente estão aqui na Faculdade de Direito. Antigamente, lá, 37 anos atrás, eram poucas as oportunidades. Agora, felizmente, são muitas pelo esforço contínuo que nós, junto com a gestão aqui da universidade, temos feito para manter a excelência da Escola de Direito e da Universidade Federal do Paraná. Então, bem-vindos, calouros e calouras, né? Daqui para frente, esse é só o começo de uma série de palestras e conferências que vocês vão ter ao longo desses 5 anos. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you.
Revolutionary.
Definitely. We need some hope. Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
I really agree with your idea. Getting past
So the idea is law is always a framework. And what I'm trying to do, so when I answer that previous question, I also have a long story like human rights. And I want to give human rights. Human rights are right to full and active participation in the life of society. So what I'm arguing is that human rights and ecocide together provide an ethical legal framework for this future project that I think the left has been deeply mistaken in not thinking. When I started doing this, everyone on the left said law is just a mechanism of domination. And it mostly is now. Mostly law can be a form of domination. But we have to take over the law and make it something else. So the idea is to join the Human Rights Project and the ecocide into a framework for political action. The political action is what will make it real, right? The law is there, except ecocide law. But without, so all I can do, all